In late 1966, the United States commits an entire Armored Cavalry Regiment to a war most of its own planners believe armor cannot fight. Tanks, the reasoning goes, are too heavy for the paddies, too loud for the jungle, and too easily trapped on Vietnam's narrow roads. Within 3 months of landing, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment is ambushed on Highway 1 by a Viet Cong force built specifically to destroy it. What happens there will not confirm the skeptics. It will overturn them, and it will do so by discarding almost everything soldiers instinctively believe about how to survive an ambush. When the Blackhorse Regiment came ashore at Vung Tau on September 7, 1966, it arrived carrying an unresolved argument. Nearly 3,800 troopers under Colonel William Cobb landed by amphibious assault. But the more important cargo was doctrinal. No one was entirely sure what heavy armor was supposed to accomplish in South Vietnam. The doubt was reasonable, and it had recent evidence behind it. The war's armor had been designed for were wars of open ground and defined front lines, massed formations meeting across European plains, the fighting the United States had prepared for in Germany against the Soviet Union. Vietnam offered none of that. It offered jungle, flooded rice paddies capable of swallowing a 30-ton vehicle, and roads hemmed in by vegetation dense enough to conceal a man a few feet from the pavement. To many senior commanders, this was terrain in which tanks would be liabilities, and there ran through the American command a settled bias that an insurgency was fundamentally an infantryman's war, in which armor belonged on the margins. That bias was not simply prejudice. An earlier attempt to field a light-tracked reconnaissance vehicle, the M114, had gone badly in Vietnam and seen the vehicle withdrawn, and a lesson many officers drew was that armored vehicles and Vietnamese terrain did not mix. The prevailing vision of the war was one of air mobility, of infantry lifted into landing zones by helicopter and pulled out the same way, striking and vanishing across country that ground vehicles supposedly could not cross. In that vision, a regiment of tanks and personnel carriers was close to an anachronism, a heavy formation built for a war that was not being fought here. The regiment had tried to engineer its way around the objection before leaving the United States. Its answer was a modification of the standard M113 armored personnel carrier, in effect an aluminium box on tracks designed only to carry infantry to the edge of a fight and let them dismount to do the actual fighting. The troopers turned that battlefield taxi into a fighting vehicle in its own right. They added a circular armored shield around the commander's .50 caliber machine gun at the top hatch, giving the gunner protection through a full circle, and mounted 2 additional M60 machine guns at the port and starboard rear of the cargo hatch, each behind its own shield. The idea did not spring from nowhere. South Vietnamese armored units had begun improvising gun shields for their exposed gunners after losing men to enemy fire, and the 11th Cavalry standardized and expanded those field fixes into a coherent package. The result could deliver fire in every direction at once, break through brush, and absorb small arms fire while its crew fought back from behind armor rather than dismounting into it. They named it the Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle, or ACAV, a term coined within the regiment itself, and the design worked well enough that the Army eventually mass-produced the conversion kit for other units. Alongside it, each squadron kept a company of M48 Patton tanks, 90mm guns on 52 tons of steel. Slower than the ACAVs, but carrying a weight of firepower and shock nothing in the Viet Cong arsenal could easily match. Together, the ACAV and the Patton gave a cavalry column something a footmobile force never had on a road: the ability to take the first blow of an ambush, keep moving, and answer it instantly with overwhelming fire. Whether that theoretical advantage would hold up against a real ambush sprung by a real enemy on ground of his own choosing was the question the regiment carried into the field. The equipment was purpose-built and the men were trained. What remained untested was whether this force could absorb contact with an enemy who had spent years refining the ambush into an art. The regiment's early mission gave that enemy every opportunity to test it. Under an operation codenamed Atlanta, the 11th Cavalry was tasked with establishing and protecting a new base camp south of Xuan Loc and keeping the highways open, above all Highway 1, the country's main artery. That meant convoy escort and road security, the unglamorous plumbing of the war, hour upon hour of dusty motoring under the constant possibility of mines and ambush. It was duty most tank crews disliked, and duty that handed the initiative, at least at the outset, to whoever was waiting beside the road. The proving ground was a stretch of Highway 1 near Suoi Cat, 50 kilometers east of Saigon, that the Blackhorse's own intelligence officer called the classic ambush site. The Americans knew it as Ambush Alley. The enemy who haunted it was the 275th Viet Cong Regiment of the 5th Division, and its record on that ground was already written. This was not a band of part-time local guerrillas, but a main force regiment, disciplined and experienced, that understood convoys and roads intimately. In June 1966, the 275th had ambushed a South Vietnamese column in the same vicinity, destroying a number of vehicles. 2 months later, it had fought at Long Tan against the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and been mauled, leaving more than 200 of its men killed and wounded. The regiment then spent months integrating replacements and recovering, a task made harder by the arrival of the 11th Cavalry, whose operations were steadily cutting the guerrillas off from the rice supplies they depended on. It was at that point, according to a regimental political officer later captured, that the enemy leadership decided another ambush would be needed to chase the Blackhorse away, or so the political officers told their soldiers. There had in fact already been one attempt, and it is worth understanding, because the December fight was in effect the enemy's correction to a plan that had nearly worked. 11 days earlier, on November 21st, a neighboring regiment had sprung a carefully prepared trap on a large Blackhorse convoy west of Swan Lock. The site was a professional piece of work, more than a mile of highway overlooked by dug-in infantry, and anchored at each end by recoilless rifles, placed to catch anything trying to flee forward or back. The convoy that drove into it was overgrown and strung out, its escort a single troop of 9 armored vehicles against a force many times its size. What saved that convoy was a warning that arrived with only seconds to spare, and a decision that would become the regiment's signature. Rather than halting in the killing zone, the escort commander ordered his vehicles to keep moving and shoot their way through, and because the warning had come just in time, much of the column punched clear before the ambush reached full weight. The rear of the convoy paid a heavy price, and the fight cost the Americans 7 killed and several vehicles destroyed. But the trap failed in its essential purpose. The convoy was not annihilated. The escorts fought their way out, and the rest of the squadron raced more than 20 kilometers to encircle the ambush site within the hour. In his analysis afterward, the intelligence officer of 2 Field Force warned that captured enemy documents listed still more targets, and concluded that it was essential for all units in the region to be alert to additional attacks on the highways in the last week of November and into December. The warning proved exactly correct, and the lesson of that first fight, that an ambushed cavalry column should drive into the guns rather than away from them, had been learned in blood 11 days before it would be needed again. When intelligence indicated that an enemy battalion was operating near Suoi Cat, the 1st Squadron conducted a limited reconnaissance of the area but found no sign of it. Shortly after, on December 2nd, the squadron was dispersed across routine tasks. Troop A was handling base camp security. Troop B was securing the rock quarry at Gia Ra, an asset the engineers improving the roads had come to depend on. The rest of the squadron was performing maintenance at Blackhorse base camp. Early that morning, a resupply convoy from Troop B, 2 tanks, 3 ACAVs and 2 trucks had made the 25-kilometer run from the quarry to Blackhorse without incident, establishing in everyone's mind an expectation of an ordinary day. At 1600, the convoy commander, Lieutenant Wilbert Radosevich, readied his vehicles for the return trip to Gia Ra. He rode in the lead tank, followed by 2 ACAVs, the 2 supply trucks, a 3rd ACAV, and the 2nd tank in trail, armor at both ends, and the soft vehicles protected in the center. Before departing, Radosevich confirmed that he had radio contact with a forward air controller flying overhead in an armed helicopter, a small precaution, consistent with the lessons of November, that would prove decisive within the hour. The route ran east through Suoi Cat. For most of the way it was a routine dusty ride. But as the convoy passed through the village, the men in the column noticed an absence of children and an unusual stillness. And that stillness registered on troopers riding exposed atop their vehicles as something wrong before any weapon had been fired. A side gunner near the back of the convoy would later describe the feeling taking hold of him on a certain stretch of road. A bad feeling that made him stop letting his flak vest air out in the heat, zip it back on, and get his hands back on his machine gun, telling his puzzled crewmates only that something did not feel right. In the lead tank, the loader was watching the village. He had passed through Suoi Cat many times, but this time he saw military-aged Vietnamese men in black pajamas coming out of a hut, men he had never seen there before, and he told his platoon leader plainly that something did not look right. The lieutenant agreed. Sensing danger, Radosevich was turning in the commander's hatch to observe both sides of the road when he accidentally tripped the turret control handle. The turret swung suddenly to the right, evidently frightening the enemy commander into prematurely firing a command-detonated mine roughly 10 meters in front of the tank before the column had fully entered the killing zone. The tank was not damaged, but a fragment of shrapnel struck Radosevich just below the eye, partially blinding him and leaving him bleeding heavily. Radosevich immediately called the ambush over the troop frequency, naming the spot as Claymore Corner. That was the unit's own nickname for that exact point on the road. Everyone in the squadron knew precisely where it was, even without a map. The choice he made in the same breath ran against every human instinct, which is what makes it worth pausing to explain. When fire erupts at close range from both flanks at once, the natural impulse is to stop, take cover, and retreat the way one came. In a road ambush, that impulse is very often fatal. An ambush is built around a fixed killing zone. Every weapon has been pre-registered on that stretch of road, the ranges known, the ends anchored by the heaviest weapons for the specific purpose of catching anyone who tries to flee. A column that halts inside the zone is destroyed methodically, one vehicle at a time. A column that reverses becomes a tangled, stationary mass in the most lethal place on the battlefield. The method the Blackhorse had drilled inverted that instinct, and it was simple enough to execute under fire. Rather than halting or withdrawing, Radosevich led his convoy in a charge through what had become a hail of enemy fire, blasting both sides of the road. The drivers followed their standard procedure and turned into a herringbone on the roadway, each vehicle angling alternately left or right so that every gun could bear outward and the column could cover a full circle. The training was exact about it. Gunners on odd vehicles fired left, gunners on even vehicles fired right. And with no visible targets, the 50 caliber gunners raked the tree line at 50 meters and the M60 gunners at 25. Almost immediately, rounds from at least two 75mm recoilless rifles, numerous machine guns, and a couple of mortars pummeled the vehicles. The Viet Cong, some of them wearing South Vietnamese army uniforms, were dug in on both sides of the road. But the herringbone tanks and ACAVs were every bit a match for the reinforced battalion's firepower. Radosevich led the two unarmored trucks out of the kill zone toward the quarry and then turned his tank around and drove back into the fight. That single decision, made by a half-blinded officer under fire, expresses the regiment's doctrine more economically than any manual could. The safe course was to be gone. He returned. The remaining combat vehicles began to leapfrog out of the zone, one herringbone position at a time. The fighting was point blank. One side gunner, wounded and knocked down inside his own ACAV in the first minutes, dragged himself back to his machine gun just in time to see three Viet Cong swinging a 75mm recoilless rifle to bear on his vehicle at close range. He fired first, cut the crew down before they could get their round off, and lived to remember the grim relief of it. At the rear, a tank had its main gun jam after a canister round broke apart in the tube, and then an anti-tank round struck the 1,200-pound commander's cupola and by one account sent it straight up in the air like a cork, carrying the 50 caliber machine gun with it. With his main gun out and his heavy machine gun gone, the tank commander ordered his driver to move back and forth through the kill zone, firing what he had, while the loaders sprayed the back deck with a submachine gun in case the enemy had climbed aboard. For a stretch of minutes, the situation was genuinely precarious. But the cavalry was already moving, and the speed of its arrival is the heart of the story. Even as Radosevich charged, help was on the way. Troop B, nearest the scene at the quarry, headed toward the action without waiting. At squadron headquarters, Company D's tanks, Troop C, and a howitzer battery all hastened toward the ambush, and Troop A followed the moment it was released from base security. Overhead, the gunship on station opened fire immediately and called for more help while the forward air controller radioed for air support. Part of Troop B was closer than the enemy realized. Earlier, acting on the intelligence that a Viet Cong unit might be operating nearby, the troop commander had sent a platoon to check a trail just east of the Highway 1 and Route 333 junction, and a dismounted patrol had pushed into the elephant grass on foot. One of the track commanders had begun noticing very large round tracks in the dust and passed word that there might be elephants about. The men joked about it, until further along the trail they found droppings that ended the joke. About that time the ambush was blown. The troopers could see red tracers whipping past, red meaning they came from friendly vehicles in the kill zone, and they ran for their ACAVs. When the convoy reached the eastern edge of the ambush, one of the ACAVs, already hit 3 times, was struck again and caught fire. At that moment, Troop B arrived from the east and came under intense fire as the enemy maneuvered toward the burning vehicle. As the after-action report put it, the lead element of the relief force smashed into a wall of fire as the ambushers tried to bottleneck the road. The troop fought its way straight through, alternating between the herringbone and forward movement and colliding with the enemy in sizable groups, then reversing and sweeping the kill zone a second time by peeling its rearmost vehicle forward into the lead in a continuous rolling attack. The Viet Cong in the roadside ditches proved especially exposed. Their commander had placed them there armed only with grenades, apparently hoping they would jam the ACAV's suspensions and disable them. The tactic failed, and they suffered horrendous casualties. There is a fragment of radio traffic that captures the confusion of those minutes. Radosevich's platoon sergeant reported South Vietnamese troops on both sides of the road. The troop commander asked the squadron commander whether any friendly South Vietnamese were in the area. The answer came back an emphatic negative, and the sergeant replied that the men had started to bring a recoilless rifle to bear and that he had blasted them. It was the same mistake in reverse a moment later, when a tank commander spotted a crew setting up a recoilless rifle and took them for South Vietnamese come to help, until the muzzle swung toward him and he blew the weapon and its crew apart at point-blank range with canister, a tank round that scatters more than 1,000 steel slugs like an enormous shotgun shell. 10 minutes after the first fire, the squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Martin Howell, arrived over the scene by helicopter and turned a firefight into a coordinated operation. He designated Highway 1 itself as a fire coordination line, a clean geographic rule that let him bring maximum firepower to bear without endangering his own men. Tactical aircraft struck to the east and south, while artillery fired to the north and west. As Company D and Troop C reached Suoi Cat, he ordered them to open fire the moment they cleared the eastern edge of the village, and the howitzer battery moved into firing position within the village itself. Over the following hours, a procession of fighters and gunships pounded the Viet Cong as they tried to escape. The strikes deliberately called in close, about 50 meters from the road. Howell would warn the ground crews to get their heads down, and the tanks and ACAVs would button up until the jets had passed, then resume firing. Now the trap closed on the people who had built it. Troop B, having traversed the entire ambush area, turned around and made a second pass back toward the east, with Company D and Troop C close behind, raking both sides of the road. The tanks fired 90mm canister, mowing down the charging Viet Cong and destroying a recoilless rifle. Troop A, sweeping in from the west, surprised a scavenging party and killed 15. The squadron commander positioned his elements to seal the pocket. Troop A to the west, Troop B in the center. Company D turned around and set to the east. Troop C sent to trap any enemies slipping out to the southeast. As the units consolidated, the Viet Cong were caught in a deadly crossfire. As darkness approached, the Americans prepared night defensive positions and the artillery shifted south to seal the escape routes, firing interdiction missions through the night as the enemy tried to slip north across the Dong Nai River. There was sporadic gunfire until morning, but never sustained contact. The ambushers had become the ambushed, and the ring around them held. A search of the battlefield the next morning revealed over 100 enemy dead. The full toll was heavier still. Documents captured in May 1967 recorded the loss at Suoi Cat of 3 Viet Cong battalion commanders and 4 company commanders, a catastrophic loss of leadership that helped explain why the survivors could no longer follow their own standard procedures. The regiment needed 4 months in its base camp to refit, and by April it was forced by the pressure of the 11th Cavalry out of the Long Can area entirely into War Zone D north of the Dong Nai. The volume of fire in that short engagement tells its own story. In under 2 hours, the elements in the kill zone and the reaction force expended roughly 130,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition, some 800 grenades from their launchers, and more than 250 tank main gun rounds, with supporting artillery adding over 1,500 shells. The Viet Cong, for their part, fired an estimated 60,000 rounds of small arms and machine gun ammunition, 75 recoilless rounds, uncounted mortar shells, and over 1,000 grenades, an unusually lavish outlay for a unit operating far from its Cambodian supply depots, and a measure of how much the enemy had staked on this one fight. The proportions are the whole point. About 25 Blackhorse troopers, mounted in 3 ACAVs and 2 tanks, had been caught in a deliberate, well-prepared ambush by a reinforced Viet Cong battalion on ground the enemy had chosen. By every conventional expectation, that small column should have been destroyed. Instead, it fought the enemy to a draw until additional firepower arrived, after which the squadron piled on with everything it had and sent the enemy packing. Only 1 ACAV was declared a combat loss, and not a single Blackhorse trooper was killed in the December 2nd fight. The two sides told very different stories about it afterward. Hanoi's press reported that its forces had knocked out 10 tanks and armored cars, killed 100 Americans, and downed 4 helicopters in 18 minutes of fighting. The men of the 275th knew better. When the survivors were later interrogated, they admitted among themselves that it had been, in their own words, a damn poor ambush. The success of these counter-ambush tactics led to their adoption as standard procedure for the future. The method was simple to state and hard to execute. The ambushed element uses all its firepower to protect the escorted vehicles and fights clear of the killing zone. Once clear, it regroups and returns to the zone from strength. Every available reinforcement is rushed to strike the flanks of the ambush, and artillery and tactical air are used to the maximum. The technique was used with success by the 11th Cavalry throughout its stay in Vietnam. The deeper significance lay in what the two ambushes settled about armor itself. Higher headquarters had questioned whether tanks and cavalry could operate at all in this terrain. Within a matter of weeks, the Blackhorse had answered by surviving exactly the kind of trap that was supposed to destroy it, and then destroying the force that set it. From that point forward, the regiment was no longer treated as an experiment to be kept on the roads, but as a maneuver force to be committed across the region. And armor was increasingly regarded as an essential part of the combat team rather than a relic misplaced in a guerrilla war. The reckoning fell hardest on the 275th Regiment, which needed months in its base camp to rebuild, and was eventually pushed out of the area entirely, into War Zone D north of the Dong Nai, by the steady pressure of the unit it had been sent to drive away. It is worth being honest, though, about what armor could and could not solve, because Suoi Cat was in some ways the exception rather than the rule. The enemy learned quickly that meeting the Blackhorse in a stand-up fight was a losing proposition, and he turned instead to the weapon that gave armor the most trouble: the mine. Mines did not require courage or coordination or the sacrifice of trained commanders. They could be planted at random, at night, on a massive scale, some improvised from unexploded shells and bombs weighing as much as 250 pounds, others command-detonated, set on roads and off them, in open field and dense jungle, with no pattern that held across the country. Between June 1969 and June 1970, in the northern part of the region alone, the 11th Cavalry encountered over 1,100 mines. The 40% it failed to detect accounted for the loss of 352 combat vehicles. Studies late in the war found that mines caused the great majority of all armored vehicle losses in Vietnam. Against the ambush, the Blackhorse had found a decisive answer. Against the mine, no one ever fully did. Yet that qualification only sharpens what happened on Highway 1. The skeptics had feared the road ambush above all, the situation in which armor seemed most vulnerable, and they had watched that exact situation become the one in which the Blackhorse was most lethal. The regiment went on to a long and difficult war, earning the Medal of Honor, fighting through the Tet Offensive, and eventually crossing into Cambodia. But its reputation was forged early, on 1.5 miles of Highway 1, in a village gone strangely silent. On the afternoon, a confident and well-prepared enemy sprang a textbook ambush and watched it turn into a defeat. The people of Long Can province understood well enough to hang a banner in gratitude to the 11th Cavalry. And for the men who fought there, the afternoon at Claymore Corner never really faded. Decades later, they would still recall it as though it had happened the day before, the first day, as more than one of them put it, that the 11th Cavalry began to become a legend.